Hello and welcome to It's Not That Simple. Our guest today is a very special one, the President of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. Good evening.
This is a great opportunity for us all to discuss the role of the European Union and also the issues that concern all of us the most, but especially young people. And we'll be doing that with someone who has a privileged perspective, I would say, on that, both because she has a long experience at the EU level, but also because her mandate has had also a big priority, as Gonçalo mentioned, of targeting young people and reaching out to young people. So that's a good start for our conversation. It's also, I would say, a timely conversation because European elections are almost around the corner, 6 months away. So it's a very good time to discuss these issues. So welcome to It's Not That Simple, President Metsola. And I would say that so let's start with the purpose of this show. It's called It's Not That Simple because the purpose is to try and break down complex issues. And the EU, I would say everyone would agree, it's complex. And it's complex maybe especially to young people, that complexity it's maybe especially felt by young people. At the same time, the EU is where many of today's big issues should be tackled. It's the right level of tackling those issues, and I would say that maybe that's especially the case for the issues concerning young people the most. So that's especially the case for those issues. So I'd like to discuss with you both the role of the EU and how to reach out to young people to meet their interests and preoccupations, and also to increase their interest in politics. And let's start with the latter. Let's start with how to reach out to young people. There's a stylized fact in political science that our interest in politics tends to increase as we age. So it's in a sense normal that when we are young, we are not that interested yet in politics. But it also seems to be the case that nowadays there's a special disinterest or lack of interest in politics, especially with traditional politics on the part of young people. And I know that that's a big part of what you have been doing in your role as President of the European Parliament since January 2022, right? Has been to reach out to young people. So my first question is, how do you think we are involved in politics, and especially the EU, can reach out to young people to increase their interest and get them to participate?
Well, first of all, good evening to you and to you for deciding to spend part of your public holiday with me on a Friday night. I think when I was your age, I might have had other things to do on a Friday night, but thank you very much for giving me the possibility. And being interested in listening to my perspective, and I hopefully get to listen to a lot of yours, so be as open and frank as possible, please. This is my 4th time in Portugal since I got elected. And on the day that I got elected, I'm not so young, but I am the youngest ever president of the Parliament. I made a commitment that I would travel to each member state and that my visit would not only be composed of photos with flags behind me, but photos and conversations with people who have not voted before, will vote for the first time, have not been interested, do not feel represented by their politicians, are disappointed by their political representatives, and with a mission that I would like to convince you otherwise. There is ultimately a statement that politics is a force for good. And for too many years, Brussels was seen as very far away. Brussels is still seen as very far away. But if we have one job as elected representatives, that is to listen. And to listen about frustrations, about the fact that Europe might not be felt by you, about the fact that the decisions that we take are not well enough explained, and about the fact that voters feel that politicians take them for granted, that elections come and go. As you said, you tend to become more interested in voting or having a political opinion the older you get. But I'll give you one statistic. We have 4 countries next year who will vote at the age of 16 for the first time, including my son. I hope he votes for me. But I hope he's not listening to this, and he will not listen. But it is our, perhaps, let's say, understanding that older people will be more interested, and therefore we did not speak enough to young people. I got involved in politics when I was young, and I had a mission. That was for my country to join the European Union. I would look at countries like this one. I had come to Portugal, and I remember thinking my country could be better. And along the way, it is a realization that countries are better because they are in the European Union, and that, as was said in the introduction, the decisions that I and my colleagues, I see members of the European Parliament from Portugal here, your members of the European Parliament, take decisions for you. Sometimes you might like them, sometimes you might not, but have the possibility to choose and ask and say that you don't like them or that you do.
But do you feel when you reach out to young people and you have conversations, and I would say have had hundreds of them so far in your mandate, do you feel that they are especially dissatisfied with traditional politics? So do you think that they feel that traditional politics no longer serves their needs, is sort of in a sense outdated?
I guess the question is what you understand by traditional politics. You know, the long-held practice, so to speak, in Europe. Let's talk about Europe, not in other countries. The United States is another particular political scene. Is you would have traditionally 2 parties, one or the other, would either be in government or in opposition, or the other way around. And perhaps it is that sense of complacency that has led to fragmentation of politics across the European Union. You see it everywhere, and with voters feeling increasingly that they are not represented by any of the political parties. Now, the easy, if I were to say, for a elected politician to say, you know what, my voters are more or less set, they know me, they will still vote, I will more or less get elected, and therefore I can continue doing exactly what I'm doing. I don't do that. I ask, I put questions, and I also, perhaps different to 4 years ago, just before the last election, at the time we were not living in crisis. This mandate has been riddled by them. If you think that it started immediately with a pandemic, and then a very difficult economic recovery, and now with a war in Ukraine, also very, very difficult climate conditions, slow investment in renewables, etc. It is ultimately those traditional political parties that delivered the exit from the pandemic and that managed to find solutions on a European level with unity that we've never seen before. So we also need to perhaps reshift our thinking of what we mean by traditional parties, but rather say that it is those parties that can guarantee your economic, let's say, stability, while not being afraid to adapt or to change. And that is perhaps what needs to be done by parties that are solid, are stable, but will require to shift with societal progress, and that did not happen everywhere.
But do you think that you're talking about the role of traditional, we'd say, mainstream parties? It's the term that's usually used when we refer to the centrist parties that used to govern in most countries. But there's also the issue, particularly with young people, I feel at least that, and studies show that there's not necessarily a lack of interest in politics, but there's a lack of interest in the way traditional politics is done via voting and participation through parties. So you see a lot of demonstrations, signing of petitions, and you've probably, I mean, you've had certainly conversations that in which people express those concerns. And it's a big challenge for politicians such as yourself to then convince people to do that, but also do the traditional part. Or the other possibility would be to change traditional politics in a way that can leverage on that interest that's being expressed through other means.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it, and also a realization that campaigning has completely changed, right? From my first campaign to the current campaign that I'm in, the way social media has taken on a completely different role when compared to traditional media. You get your news on your phone, on social media feed. Frankly speaking, sometimes it is correct, sometimes it is incorrect, and it's very difficult to tell the difference. That, if anything, protests, demonstrations are rarer now than they used to be. Though we see them, and you see them, and you participate.
Very good point.
But what we need to do, and that's my responsibility, my colleagues' responsibility, is first of all to make sure that there are enough candidates that can encapsulate the rage you could have, the frustration you could have, and convince you to go to the ballot box. Because if you only demonstrate and you only protest, you might not like, or you might like whoever gets elected even less. And I'll say this, next year 720 members of the European Parliament will get elected. Whether you vote or you don't, they will get elected. Now, the question is, when you vote and your member is there, you will have somebody to engage with for the next 5 years. When you don't vote, there will be nobody to engage, except perhaps for you to become even more frustrated and even more angry. And I think that that is also a responsibility on behalf of all of us, that democracy works both ways, accountability on one hand and participation on the other.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect segue for a slightly more personal question, because you mentioned that you started participating in politics when you were young, so in your student years.
Younger.
In your student years, when you were still a student. But of course, the challenges back then were very different. As you said, your main priority was to get Malta to get to the European Union. What do you think, if it were now, and were you to join politics, what do you think would motivate you?
First of all, I think if I look back and see the biggest difference between now and then is that I was one of the few women running for politics. Very few women ran then. It is still extremely harder for women in politics, and perhaps we could go into details or personal experiences on that. There was, as you say, a cause at the time, back to traditional parties, one party, which was the one I joined. Nobody in my family who has ever been involved in politics. My parents were extremely unhappy. To a certain extent, they probably still are unhappy that I'm involved in politics, because it's very hard for my parents to see, very vibrant political, sometimes, very
the exposure
big
that
attacks.
comes with it. Yeah.
Pardon?
The exposure that comes with it.
Yeah, absolutely, for me and my family, my sisters and my kids. But there was, as you say, there was one mission that was clear to me and my generation, that our country's place had to be in Europe, our standards would increase, our judiciary would be better, our seawater and breathing air would be cleaner. It was really that kind of campaign. Socially we would progress, etc. Equality would be enforced. Today, I don't know whether I would enter politics, and if I would, it would probably be in order to hope for change. If somebody had to ask me, what do you wish also to change or to be different, I would say that I wish our society was less divided, that intolerance is not the order of the day, that disagreeing with somebody does not mean hatred. We see that much more. It's much tougher, much more hostile. And in a way, if I look back, it's been 20 years, because I first ran for elections 20 years ago. And I used to run for all sorts of student councils and before. But it was really, at the time, you had a framework within which you operated. Today, it is much broader. The message can become more viral, more quickly, but it is easier for a misfact to run around until you counter it with what is correct. And I think today I would possibly try to make that difference by bridging, in a way, somebody told me, because we use the word polarized, society is polarized, things are very black and white. It's much easier to be on a panel with 6, 7, 8 other candidates and be that black and white. It's much harder to be the gray.
Of course.
Not so sexy or exciting. But the world is gray, and you need to be the one to be able to give time for that argument to get through, because it is much easier to give easy answers to difficult questions than a proper answer.
Yeah.
And that would be the biggest challenge that one would have as a new candidate today, and a fresh one, not used to online hostility or physical one even.
And you feel that polarization and the impact that social media has had has been felt, I would say, especially at the national level. Do you feel that the EU is somewhat protected from that, or do you think that...
Oh, no.
So in your experience, the effect is the same?
No.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, it depends on how well you know your members of the European Parliament. So the country I come from, everybody knows they're members of the European Parliament. And it is a very vocal one. It's a very direct electoral system. What I would say is a benefit of a very difficult 4.5 years is that Europe has taken on a much more prominent role. Is that when the pandemic hit, Europe was the only answer. Portugal had the presidency at that time. This country was running the European Union. Everybody knew that it was Portugal. When Russia invaded Ukraine, everybody looked to Europe in those countries in order to seek a different path. Whether Moldova, Western Balkans again. And today, if you speak, let's say, about migration, which is a very big challenge across the European Union from different perspectives, and also extremely instrumentalized by those who would like to attack Europe rather than see the role that Europe could play, if you ask citizens today, they tell you that only a solution on a European level can be found. And that gives us the responsibility to deliver. And that also means that with that responsibility comes a great sensibility or sensitivity to how you are felt, how you are hit by a decision from European Union. And again, and this is still painful, this is in my first campaign, I had said this. I was a student at the time, I was still studying, and I had to find a few slogans. And I had said, who would have told me that 20 years later the same would still be the case? That when national governments, or really anybody, wants to take credit for something, then it's never Europe. But when something is wrong, Europe is at fault. Who would have told me I would still be able to say the same thing, but it really still is the same.
The temptation is too big.
The temptation is for you to externalize the issue and never make it your responsibility. And, we have seen it in I keep going back to the pandemic, but like the instinctive nature of humans, that people thought that a virus would stop at a physical border between one country and another. We shut everything down. That was the instinct. It was our neighbors who were bringing it in, rather than this is everywhere and we need to tackle it together. We managed, we got there, and we emerged stronger. But we had to go through a lot of soul searching, and I'm a lawyer. We tend to hide behind legal obstacles for things that we don't want to do. I'm looking at Carlos Coelho there, so I'm going to, he knows what I'm talking about, because we worked a lot in the same committee. But at the end of the day, we found the political will to overcome what we had pretended legally was impossible for many years. And that Europe did. So I think we should say that that's the silver lining out of a very difficult period of how much more European decisions have been made.
Yeah, and you touched on two very interesting points there. One is the fact that the EU is increasingly more important because many more topics need to be dealt at the EU level, not at the national level. And the second one that you mentioned before is the fact that European politics have become more salient because of social media and because of internet and whatnot. And so that those two combined might give us some reason for optimism, because that means that people's interest in European politics are increasing due to at least two causes. The first of them is completely good. The second of them is a double-edged sword, but has this positive effect nonetheless, right?
Yes.
Because if there's more salience of politics also at European level, it means that people are more interested.
Yes. I mean, the upside, of course, is that a message can get through easily. Could be easier. Our regulations could be better used for that. You get to go viral much more easily today, but the question is, for what? Quality and content is still important, and I see it myself that I could have social media posts that really go into detail on a particular subject, and it's a difficult one. People read it and sort of like it, etc. But I could have, I could randomly, be pictured on the street with a cat or a dog, and it does better. So it also, it's really an understanding of how people's perception of politics is, and not to cheapen it in a way, but it's completely different to interact and how you actually have a conversation. And my take is that it is our responsibility to be provocative, ask questions even when they are uncomfortable, and then be ready to answer them. Parliament has gone through some difficult few months, and that was my instinct immediately to react and grab the bull by its horns. I don't know whether this is translated into Portuguese.
It does.
But sometimes things don't really translate literally. So
in this case, it does completely. So you're safe.
I'm safe. This has happened to me in other countries. So that we really said we'll tackle the problem at source immediately, head on, rather than hope for it to go away. And that was not perhaps the easiest, but it was, I'm convinced, the correct way to do it.
Yeah. And I mentioned in the beginning that in my introduction that the EU is especially complex, and that's, of course, sometimes a limitation when people in general, and especially people in your roles, are trying to communicate with people, with voters, and explain how it works. And the fact is, the EU is especially complex for good reasons to a great extent, but it is complex. You have the Commission, you have the Parliament, you have the European Council, so you have different institutions that make it more difficult for people to follow politics. I'm very curious to know your take on this, both on the communication dimension and on the political dimension, on whether you think this should change somewhat.
Yeah, Henry Kissinger passed away yesterday, and the last time I met him was here in Portugal, some months ago. And the classic saying when he asked, if I had to call Europe, who would it be?
Yeah.
And he reported it and spoke about it, throughout his life. And there were memes going around going, we still don't have the answer for you, Henry. But I think that the complexity is, to a certain extent, necessary and justified when it comes to making sure that somehow these 27 member states work together with huge advances. I mentioned borders before, free movement, equality of access to opportunity, the single market that has, meant that we have, essentially possibility of goods to move for you to start a business, making it easy. However, it's still not easy enough. We have been promising to reduce bureaucracy for decades. Sometimes we find ourselves increasing it rather than decreasing it. Yes, there is, skepticism and some people who play by the rules and some people who don't. But I myself sometimes question, what is that acronym? How on earth are we going to explain this acronym to somebody who, you know, who feels that Europe is very, very far away? How are we going to translate what we have done in terms of economic governance, in terms of digital security, in terms of making sure that it's easier for you to access funds in a way that you understand it, and you can actually access those funds. You can write to your political leaders. You can make a complaint if you feel that you have been unjustly treated. If you have if your government is supposed to be better, if your journalists are supposed to be better protected, how difficult can it be? So even I share some of those frustrations. And yes, complexity is by virtue of the way the European Union is built, to a certain extent, necessary, and that's a beauty in itself. Okay, I say beauty, maybe it's the wrong word, but you know, I love to study it as a lawyer when I was a student, etc. But today, as somebody who needs to explain the huge range of legislation that we have passed, whether it's on AI, whether it's on helping Ukraine, whether it's on being the most climate ambitious continent on this planet, at the same time saying, we're going to help you. Here I understand that housing is a big issue. You know, I don't want anybody to say housing is not something that the European Union deals with. For me, social inequalities need to be addressed. And that means that the European Union can help. The European Union can recognize that in some countries more than others, there is economic inequality that is different from others. And that is something that we need to let's say, attract or grab onto, because ultimately the European Union is about not making people the same, but giving people equal access. We still don't have that in the European Union. And that is not so difficult to say, and it should not be so difficult to deliver. I'm convinced.
And you think the European Parliament can also have a role on that?
Oh yeah, I mean, we speak about everything. And the European Parliament has been, year after year, you know, increasing its powers, whether they need a change of the treaty, the so-called constitution that we have, or not. The Parliament over the past years has sought its, you know, whether we initiate legislation, whether we hold other institutions to account. We are the budgetary authority, we are co-legislators, so we legislate. And there were cases when, if it were not for the Parliament, such as, for example, what we call conditionality, another very difficult, overly long word. But essentially what it means is that if a country does not behave, in other words, all those criteria that had to be met have to still be met by those countries that want to join. Once you are a member, if a government ignores them, then there have to be consequences in how funds are distributed, in how that means that your judiciary needs to work properly, your rollout of EU funds has to be done properly, that if I talk, for example, as to in my country, that corruption needs to be stamped out, that if all is not well, if journalists are persecuted, literally, then that government needs to be told by Europe. If it were not for the European Parliament, this would not be possible today. All of this is now law.
And it's interesting because you've made, in your mandate, you've made the European Parliament very active, I would say. You were, for instance, you were one of the first politicians to visit Kiev, if I'm not mistaken, right? Barely a month after the invasion. So that in and on itself is a bold action, and I would say it was probably an impactful experience too, right?
You know, I spent my time as a young pro-European activist on trains in Eastern Europe. We were joining the European Union together with a bunch of those countries, 9 others, okay, Malta, Cyprus, and the rest. And the minute I stepped on that train in Poland on the way 12 hours to Kiev on the 1st of April, that was the day that the images from Bucha came out, I knew that I was doing the right thing. And, you know, my husband is Finnish. Don't ask me why and how I have a Finnish husband. You cannot find somebody from further away. But I met him as a youth activist, and I knew on that day, I mean, he was the only one that I had told, also my parents, but that's a different chapter, that was the time when because he was also growing up in politics, that, you know, that makes it doing things on a European level, going from one different country to another, in this case, a war on our continent, as the right and only thing to do, and stand in front of their parliament and say that we will not leave you alone. And that was, it didn't take many moments for me to decide.
I imagine. Well, in all programs of this is Not That Simple, we always end with a series of what we call rapid-fire questions. We ask the same questions to every guest, and these are short questions for short answers. So are you ready?
Sure.
So the first one is, what is one personality trait that a good leader could really benefit from having, and why?
Listening. Because if you listen, you learn, and you can deliver on what the person in front of you wants. If you can't, you would have listened enough to be able to say, this is not possible now, hopefully soon.
It all starts with listening.
Absolutely. Politicians don't do that enough.
That's very true. Second question.
I've just spoken for half an hour. I have to listen to this. Yeah.
What is the biggest challenge humanity is facing right now?
Division on everything. That it is the us and them. Families not talking to each other. You know, I spoke to English friends of mine, you know, who tells me post-Brexit it's still too sore. American friends of mine who says, you know, upcoming elections have split our society into, our generation into.
Yeah, same thing in Brazil, for instance.
Same thing in Brazil, let's say Argentina. Division that we have to be able to bridge by talking and listening to somebody who has a completely different opinion to ours, but not leading to intolerance and hatred.
If you could change one thing in the world by magic today, what would it be?
For fear of sounding like those people who participate in contests and say world peace, I will say that I would like to, you know, inject optimism, or infuse rather than inject optimism and altruism in the world. That would make it better for us to live side by side together with tolerance.
And finally, what is the most important learning in your life?
That I've learned, or
that you've learned, yeah.
Ooh. Never to give up. I didn't get elected the first time. I didn't get elected the second time either. The easiest thing would have been for me to say, you know what, no more politics for me. That gave me the courage of, whenever I fell, that I stand right up and walk and learn from my experiences and take the next step. And I hope that this experience that I've learned, that was taught to me, that women in politics who came before me told me, that I can do this for the next generation of women politicians.
Beautiful way to finish. President Roberta Metsola, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for being on that side. See you next time.